Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
It's just really trying to just tell this true, tragic story the best we can and do it justice for Chris, his family and loved ones. But really the film is dedicated to victims of the Berlin Wall.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Chris Jeffroy was the last person to be shot dead at the Berlin Wall, and a new short film called Whispers of Freedom portrays his story. I speak with the film's director, Brandon Ashplant, who shares the challenges of accurately portraying real individuals. Actors Cameron Ashplant and Wendy Makkena reflect on research they undertook to authentically represent life in East Germany. The discussion also touches on the emotional impact of visiting key locations, including Chris's grave and the site of his death, as well as the delicate process of obtaining consent from his family to tell this story. I'm delighted to welcome Brandon, Cameron and Wendy to our Cold War conversation.
Sort of from a personal perspective, I was born in the 90s and sort of obviously post-Cold War period. So for my generation, sort of growing up in this late 90s, early 2000s and into the mid-2000s, there was a sense of actually this collective memory was not so collective anymore, I think it's fair to say. And obviously the work of like yourself, Ian, on this podcast and various other channels and forms of education do exist and are out there. Memory is fading, and so many of my peers think this is actually ancient history, despite it having only culminated really 35, 40 odd years ago. And so that sense of sort of being ancient history was kind of surprising, but also not in the same time, because we grew up in a period where that wasn't a staple. The Berlin Wall had long gone, and the continent was unified once again. So I think it was just a sense of trying to revive a story from that period of time, and I think in a sense of how we go about that and there's various ways we could have sort of brought this to life on the screen. But inevitably, it felt only appropriate that we sort of, touched on this sense of barrier, Berlin Wall, and sort of play on that. But also, I think the interesting thing for me was exploring, what kind of a society actually put this barricade of breeze block, concrete and barbed wire up overnight, effectively, and cut the continent in two. But then it dawned on us, I think, that to some extent trying to do it in a way that is personable and trying to bring a real sort of personal touch to the story we're trying to tell is important to sort of having that emotional, resonance with the audience. So long story short, we sort of landed on trying to tell a story of an escape. And actually, again, then dawned on us that actually it'd be interesting to sort of explore this idea of sort of the last person to attempt the attempted escape or attempt to escape from East Germany. So we sort of landed on Chris as this natural sort of, I guess, story to tell. And instead of sort of trying to tell a sort of fictional account, we decided, well, why not try and do to the best of our ability? Obviously, it's a huge burden of responsibility to get right, but to try and tell this story the best we can and bring it to life, just so that, again, these stories and this memory of the Cold War period and how horrific it was for so many people isn't forgotten going forward.
Very much the theme of the podcast, to be fair, preserving these stories so they aren't forgotten. Cameron, how much did you know about East Germany and the Cold War before you started this project?
So me and Brandon, we're both very much interested in geopolitics and in history. I studied geography at university, and so I've delved in a lot of different case studies, and I studied history at that school when I was younger. I went to Berlin with school, so I was very much interested in that particular period of history. But obviously, knowing individual cases such as this one, and I didn't know any particular stories to kind of tap into. And I think it was only once we started preparing for this and started doing some research, I engaged a lot with some of the music that he would have listened to in that particular era and stuff like that. That's the only time, and that's a lucky thing you get to do as an actor, is you get to put your feet in the shoes of some people from history that you wouldn't do in any other kind of art form. But yeah, it was only in that moment where we built this apartment and I felt like we were in East Germany. We really started to understand more what it was like to live in that era. But yeah, I've always been fascinated by the era. But yeah, there had to be a lot of research to kind of get it right, to be authentic, and kind of tell the wider story through this one person's real world experience.
Did you listen to any episodes of Cold War Conversations to help you with that?
Unfortunately, that fell outside of my research. I didn't come across that. I didn't do that.
Right, that'll be removed in the edit then.
Yeah.
And Wendy, how much were you aware of this period and what life was like in East Germany?
Very little, although it's a bit surprising because my father was from Berlin, and my family has a lot of, unfortunately, World War II history, because they fled from Berlin to Shanghai and then came here. That was obviously a long time before the wall was built. But it was good for me to learn about it. And I learned about it through doing some research because of Brandon's film. Wonderful film.
And you're portraying living people. In your case, Wendy, Cameron is depicting obviously Chris, who sadly died. How difficult was it to get the consent of Chris's remaining family to tell the story? That's maybe a question for Brandon.
Yeah, that's right. So that was an incredibly important part of the process. And, we wouldn't have sort of embarked on the journey had we not gone through that important jumped through that important hoop. So we sort of, as a first sort of port of call, reached out to myself and the team. Can't take the credit. So myself and the team reached out to the Berlin Wall Foundation, or Berlin Wall Memorial, depending on which sort of translation you look at. And two individuals there were very helpful in sort of directing us and sort of giving us a bit of input. So first of all, Dr. Sarah Bornhorst, who sort of heads up the sort of biographical unit at the foundation or the memorial. And then also her colleague, Gerhard Sauter, who also supported in terms of sort of historical advisory as well. We kind of came to them with sort of a formative idea without the script actually having been written. And sort of from there went and sort of pinned down this story to be the one to tell. I think it was interesting in the sense of from there, Sarah, Dr. Bornhorst, is very well connected to many families in the former East Germany who went through horrific experiences with the Stasi and had family members who unfortunately died in the process of attempted escapes and so forth. And so she managed to sort of reach out to Karin, who Wendy portrays, and sort of put her in touch and sort of said, look, there's a production that's keen to make a film about this story, and obviously that's Chris's story. And long story short, Karin effectively communicated to Sarah, who then told us that actually she wasn't entirely keen in terms of being involved in the sort of ins and outs, because we were keen to sort of at this stage interview and sort of hold conversations and do our sort of homework to get the script off the ground. But it was entirely understandable. She whilst I think in years gone by she'd been keen to support the cause, if you like, in telling this period in time and reviving the history, and in the early days obviously getting justice for Chris. There was a sense, I think, that she was in a point in her life where she wanted to move on, and so she sort of felt like she wouldn't be involved in the process and sort of let us know about that, but sort of gave us the blessing to make the film. So it just meant that we then had to do our research, really go out and sort of do the formative stuff, so the pre-production work and so forth. And so we reached out to various other sort of institutions, obviously beyond the Berlin Wall Foundation itself. We reached out to the Federal Foundation for the Reappraisal of the SED dictatorship in Germany, and then also the DDR Museum in Berlin, who eventually came on as financial sponsors as well, and actually sort of were very helpful in terms of giving us set dressing and sort of actually artifacts from their extensive collection and shipped them over to the UK to shoot with. So from there we sort of built up a network of Berlin-based sort of charities and organisations who are sort of committed to preserving this time period, and they were very keen to help and support and direct us in the right way to get this story told correctly. And it would be remiss of me to say as well that we had incredible support and help from one person in particular. So Katja Hoyer, who many of your listeners will probably no doubt know from her incredible book Beyond the Wall. And Katja sort of came on initially as a script consultant, but that eventually sort of quickly evolved into her being our sort of lead historical advisor and technical consultant. And Katja sort of did an incredible amount of work for us in the sort of behind the scenes early days to sort of do world building and make sure we can bring the former East Germany, or East Berlin in particular, to life on screen. So that's a long way of saying, hopefully we went through the proper processes and means and sort of got the consent to tell the story, and then went away and did our homework as well.
Katya has been on Cold War Conversations, unsurprisingly. I did interview her about her book Beyond the Wall, which is an excellent read and a great insight into East Germany. In fact, it's one of the most popular episodes as well. And it was a real fun chat with her to talk about her very early life, because I think the wall came down when she was about 5 or something like that. I mean, I think, Cameron, when we were talking a moment ago, you sort of alluded to trying to get into the mood of East Germany. And, you mentioned listening to the same music that Chris might have been listening to. Were there any other sort of techniques you were using to try and get into that East German mindset? And I guess I'd like, Wendy, for you to give a view on that after Campbell.
Yeah, so I tried to listen to some of the music, particularly around the period when I was learning the lines, just because I think it's nice to kind of delve into something that would have been in his headspace. It was noted that he was into his music, and the music was quite a big part of, I think, East Germany, in that they had a quite unique music scene at that particular point in history. So I tried to listen to lots of different music. I also went back and watched the various films that there are on East Germany. Some that are more well known, some that are less well known. But again, that was just to give me an idea of kind of the streets they walked down and what their houses looked like, and to kind of see how their everyday was kind of organized and structured. So yeah, I did a bit of that. I've been traveling in the past, and I've been to the former Yugoslavia and been on some tours around former communist areas of Belgrade, and so there was kind of a lot of experience through visits like that as well that I could kind of tap into. Yeah, ultimately, Chris is a guy who had a lot of passions and breeds, some of them not too dissimilar to my own. So I would kind of relate to a lot of his kind of aspirations that he had. He actually wanted to be an actor. So I kind of shared that, I suppose, with him. So yeah, so there was all those kind of elements that I really utilised to try and get into his headspace and try and understand why he was trapped at the time, and to try and understand kind of where he was at that particular point in history where he made the unfortunate attempt that led to his death.
What were the films that you watched? I'm intrigued now. I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but I went through. I have like a list of films I want to watch, like the IMDb top 250. And there were some films in there that were German and set in Germany. We actually filmed on one of the streets from a film that I watched when we went and visited Berlin, from the film The Lives of Others. So I watched that. I also watched a couple of German films made in more recent years. But yeah, I wouldn't remember the names off the top of my head. But they were all interesting stuff in terms of even the smallest things. What is the packaging on their jam when they butter their toast in the morning? All these little things that was like world building, because they didn't have Coca-Cola and stuff like this. You know what I mean? So it was trying to try and build that world in my head. And then obviously once we got on set, that was made extremely easy by the fantastic art department that it would taking place, and we had all these amazing props. Some of them were real artifacts, and the DVR moved in. So all these kind of things made me and Wendy like easy, because it felt like we were in a East Berlin apartment block. So that was really helpful. But it was good to engage with some media, music, film beforehand to kind of get a better understanding before we got on set.
Yeah, they had Vita Cola instead of Coca-Cola, which was an East German brand. I've never tried it. I don't know whether you tried it when you were in Berlin. I think they still make it, actually.
Really?
So you could have had the authentic taste of East Berlin as well. So, Wendy, how about you?
I drank lots of Vita Cola to do some background. Never heard of that. In terms of music.
Well, just in terms of trying to get into the vibe of what it was like to live in East Berlin. Yeah. So you understood that mindset.
Well, Brandon, being a wonderful director, supplied me with all sorts of things to watch and all sorts of information. And I watched a documentary film, the name of it, and Karin was interviewed, and That was devastatingly sad and incredibly helpful for me in terms of doing the role and getting myself into it. I read a lot about East Berlin, about when the wall went up and how that came to be. But I really had it easy because, again, the set, the whole atmosphere that Brandon created, when I walked onto the set, it just felt like I was there. Felt like I would have imagined an apartment in East Berlin would look like. Karin was a single mother and had 2 boys. She was always listening to the radio. And it was dingy and a little dark. And honestly, I don't know how they got through. But again, it wasn't hard. And also I had for inspiration my family story. Actors drawn anything they get, but my grandmother and great grandmother were left alone in Berlin for a long time before they were taken. And I only know this because of the Arlsen archives in Germany. And I've always imagined since I was young what that must have been like to be left sort of stranded in a city. It can't be anything like what Karin experienced, but it was as close as I could get. So I had all this emotional stuff to draw on. And again, the set that was created and the atmosphere that was created was just perfect. It was not hard to get into Karin's head.
And how do you deal with portraying somebody who is still alive, who's a real person, and you're having to tell their story? That must make it a lot tougher.
Yes, an interesting question. I would say it actually, I love the idea of, as an actor, as an artist, some of us still believe in muses. And Karin being alive and out there somewhere was my muse. I dedicated it to this mom who gone through this absolutely horrific, unthinkable experience. And knowing she might see it maybe one day, and it didn't actually make it more difficult. It actually fed me. It was like, well, now I can dedicate this to someone.
Brandon, how did you ensure that the dialogue sounded authentic, and you weren't sneaking in modern words that wouldn't have been used, in East Germany? How did you manage that? Was that Katya helping out?
He stolen the words right from my mouth. So we did have a story written down on page, but the sort of linguistic for the screenplay, if you like, didn't come a little bit until later on. So initially, I think the draft that she read was probably quite shocking. I think she wouldn't be, she'd probably be happy to admit, in the sense of that sort of, modern and also English, specifically or British English linguistics. So it was really important that we sort of weeded those out and effectively just made it sort of actually as authentic as can be, in the sense of we are sort of telling this story for an international audience, so that the default language is in English. Cameron and Wendy and the cast are speaking in English as a predominantly sort of British and American, probably fair to say, cast, with a few sort of German actors as well in there. But so, as I say, the spoken language is English. So it was trying to transfer that sort of, not just German, as you say, but actually East German sort of dialect, and particularly from the 80s, and bringing that slang in and trying to transfer it across into English as we know it today as best as we can. And actually, as part of that, we did sneak in a few sort of German, or specifically East German phrases from that time period into the script. So there's one lovely moment where Chris and Christian meet. So Cameron and Dara Cowley, who plays Christian Godion, meet and have a beer and discuss sort of finishing up school for the summer. I can't for the life of me remember off the top of my head what the phrase is, but it was a Katya suggestion. And for those who watch the film, when you watch that beer scene, look out for it. So those are the Easter eggs that actually hopefully sort of an East German audience, despite watching in English, can actually pick up on and enjoy whilst watching the film.
I'm just intrigued because I've not seen any of this film, yet. All I've seen is the stills, and I'm becoming more and more intrigued now to watch it. Now, when you're filming in Berlin, you actually see the locations where Chris and Karin lived. You see the location where he was killed, I think, and you visit his grave. I mean, Cameron, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was towards the end of the shoot in Berlin. We were going around with someone from Berlin, and so he just found out that he lived across the road from the grave, and so he agreed to take us there to visit it. And I think it does feature at the end of the film, at the closing moment, a picture of a videotape of the gravestone. It's very to visit that grave and obviously reinstate that we were telling someone's real story, someone's real tragic story, because he would still be there today. And there is something more tragic about the fact it was the last person, or almost those crazy questions of kind of what if he hadn't have gone? A year later the wall was gone, and so yeah, it was interesting to see that, and also to see the actual site where he got shot as well, which is marked by a memorial. But at the end of the day, it's just if that memorial wasn't there, and Berlin's very much like this, then they would know it's you kind of walk past, and whole city's filled with history. Some of it's marked, some of it's not, and you do wonder what's in every corner. So it was nice to see that was acknowledged where he'd been killed, and I think it was a very impactful way to kind of close playing that graphic to kind of visit the site where it actually took place.
It is such a tragic story because he's shot in February and the shoot to kill order is stopped in April and the wall opens in November. I was actually in Berlin in June 1989, so I did see it whilst the wall was still up and went through the checkpoints and got the S-Bahn over the wall. And when I watch films like Lives of Others and stuff like that, and there's some great sort of like old VHS video footage of, I think there's one of a tram driving through East Berlin, and you're in the driver's seat, but you get that whole vibe of what it looked like, because it did look like World War II had finished last week in a lot of the side streets, because the buildings just weren't repaired or maintained. But anyway, this isn't about me, this is about you. I should stop my little monologue there.
I think it was interesting when we were in Berlin, they were dressed up in Stasi outfits and stuff like this, which a lot of the people walking past in the public probably remember seeing 30, 40 years ago. Probably were a bit perplexed as to why people were wearing those uniforms today on the side of a street corner. But yeah, there was quite a big unit in Berlin of people who got on board. There was actually some actors from Australia and Greece who now lived in Berlin. And there was some production crew, a lot of them working in the tourist industry there, and who obviously came with a lot of knowledge as well. So yeah, there was a big unit of people who were kind of involved.
Just to add to that, I mean, I think it was our production driver Thomas Schmidt who had taken us to Bamschelweg and Treptow and all these places where Chris's grave is, and also the memorial. He kindly took us to those places after we finished production. But yeah, in addition to him as our production driver, there was a huge amount of interest and input from sort of local East German sort of reenactment groups, but also historians and others who came in to support. So, and I think in a sense, because we sort of had to get permits to close a few side streets and a few roads, and we actually sort of closed off a section of Karl Marx Alley to film outside Cafe Moscow and that sort of stuff. So there wasn't actually too much public engagement at the time. But yeah, huge amount of input from the local film scene and also historian groups, and they brought down sort of everything from costumes and historically appropriate sort of gear through to even civilian stuff. So we managed to hire some vehicles and so forth. So we hired a Wartburg 353, a Trabant 600, and actually later in the shoot, which was later in the film, a Gauss 69M, which was sort of a border patrol Jeep. So yeah, it's interesting trying to film or recreate, shall I say, sort of the 80s former East in what is now sort of actually just modern busing.
Yeah. I mean, the city's changed so much now. I mean, I've been back probably about 5 or 6 times since the wall came down, and every time I'm still struggling to to, find the bits that still remain that still have that East German feel. And I think some films they now make in like Romania, if they want to get that Eastern European vibe. I mean, Berlin wasn't the only location you were filming in. Where did you do the Berlin Wall sequences?
It's probably fair to say we probably did 90% of production on the island of Guernsey, with probably 2% in London and sort of, I guess, the remaining or whatever percent in Berlin. So a lot of the interior locations were filmed here in Guernsey. We did the mock-up of the interior sort of Plattenbau tower block here in Guernsey and some various other interior locations, the restaurant that Chris works in and so forth. And then, we recreated the sort of Berlin Wall here in Guernsey. So that was quite interesting and created a bit of buzz around the local sort of, the local media, because they were sort of interested as to how we were going to do that logistically, I guess, first and foremost. But I think we managed to pull it off. It basically meant we ended up sort of effectively sort of agreeing with the local water treatment plant, or one of them, that's actually currently still in use. It's an active treatment plant to allow us to sort of go in there certain times of the day to sort of set dress and everything from check hedgehogs to barbed wire and everything, and sort of recreate the interior section of the wall rather than the outer piece we filmed elsewhere. So it was very exciting, but quite an experience trying to rebuild the Berlin Wall. Obviously, that's an example of where, as you say, various productions these days go to Romania or sort of further east to Europe to find appropriate sort of looking exterior buildings and facades that you couldn't find in modern Berlin. But we sort of had to obviously we had to basically rebuild a segment of the Berlin Wall ourselves to do it justice and get it right. Because obviously the parts that still stand are, they're nowhere near as they were back then.
I saw some of the stills of the treatment plant, and I think while I was doing the search, it brought up some Channel Island newspaper reporting on it, I think, or something like that. When you look back to the 1980s and the clothing and the fashions that they, were wearing, and particularly in East Germany, what was that like? I mean, is it almost like as soon as you've got the clothes on and you're on set, you're almost gone back 30, 40 years, and you're in that focus then?
Absolutely. In 1989, I was 20? It's funny. It didn't seem that dated to me. In my head, the fall of Berlin Wall was like a long, long time ago. When I was in my 20s, I was not paying any attention to any news reports at all. So it was, I thought, this is a long, long time ago. It really, the clothes didn't feel that dated to me. Again, because my age, maybe to Brandon and Cameron, but it was so easy to slip into that. It was really this feeling that you created it was a dystopian feeling, right? And not unlike what's going on now. But it was not difficult. All I can say is the clothes just felt like I could be wearing them. I felt like I could be her. Oh, I'm a mom. And so that also helped.
I can distinctly remember seeing the news that the wall had opened and thinking, my God, I'm living through a piece of history that's going to be remembered for hundreds of years. And it was just incredible. In that period, we thought the Soviet Union was going to be there forever. And then within a couple of years, that had disappeared as well. Crazy, crazy times. Cameron, what was it like, putting on the stonewashed denims and, Chris's 80s gear?
I remember it was like, flared jeans, lots of like checkered shirts, and we had this big black leather jacket, and I quite like that as like an item of the costume, because it's something I think the story itself spans about 4 or 5 years in terms of there's some significant time jumps, but he kind of keeps that jacket as an item of clothing. So that was kind of like a big the character, but it was all not clothes that I would wear, not clothes I've ever worn before. It was of a different era. And so some of the stuff like the flared jeans, some people that definitely has come back. that helped feel like, this was a period piece. This was a different era from the era I currently live in. People haven't got phones in their pockets, or so there was a different world, and the costume, like we've talked previously about the music and stuff like that, was all very helpful in terms of getting in the headspace.
Was there any item you thought, I hope I can keep this after we finish filming?
I can't say. Although I say that, I've got the jeans in my cupboard here, the jeans I wore for the film, but only because I used it for something else afterwards for a show. But yeah, I can't say I'd ever be walking around in any of the costumes.
Yeah. How about you, Wendy? Was there anything you wanted to hang on to?
Now that you mention it, yeah, there was a radio in the kitchen that Karin listens to seemingly round the clock. And that was pretty cool. Remember having something like it back in the old days. But I like that radio, yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw that in one of the stills, actually. I saw the radio in there. With telling the story, Brandon, I mean, inevitably with a movie, you want to add drama, you want to add some emotions in there. How do you do that respectfully in terms of particularly this story?
Well, I think, to be honest, it sounds perhaps a bit on the nose, but I think in a sense that it is such a tragic story. We really didn't have to inject much emotion to sort of amplify that. I mean, the guys, Cameron, Wendy, Dara, and the sort of core cast put on such magnificent performances that it really, by the time the film culminates and without spoiling anything, the end credits roll, it really is pretty heart-wrenching stuff. Frankly, we didn't always come at it from the angle of how do we inject any more emotion. It was just how do we tell this appropriately, with compassion and a sense of responsibility to do it justice and do it right. This is interesting because when we sort of had that raw cut, the first sort of rough cut of the film, it's almost like you watch it and you think, oh God, what have we done? It just looks awful. Or, it's just not what we wanted from a sort of production perspective. Obviously the performances were incredible, but it's the production side. And then it's only when you grade it, you cut it. And the most important bit I found was injecting the score, the original score, so the music. So our composer, a guy called William Goodrum, who actually sort of started off his career, interestingly, sort of composing comedy films, sort of US comedy films. So he composed Shallow Hal, which stars Jack Black, for example. So he's sort of since moved his sort of career on from that and sort of has now refocused on sort of European drama films. So he frequently collaborates with Eduardo Ponti, the Italian director, and so on. And he sort of brought a real sense of the Cold War, as weird as it sounds, but a sense of that period in time to the film. I mean, he's a guy of the sort of, I think, I don't want to sort of age him. Sorry to William if you're listening, but sort of, I think he was sort of, a guy of that period growing up in the 80s and, the late 70s and early 80s. And that was his period. So he had a distinct understanding of what it meant to be an 80s kid, and probably similar to yourself in the sense of sort of, the Berlin Wall was going to be there forever and that sort of thing. So he really injected a sense of the Cold War into the film just purely through the score. It was, he worked magic. And particularly towards the end, the sense of heightened tension, the escalating drama. There's one segment where on the way, Chris and Christian are effectively hiding from what is a border guard on a sort of bank just within a sort of strip or sort of no man's land before they get to the outer eastern wall, before they then get into the death strip. There's just the music is absolutely stunning, and that for me is what heightens the tension. I mean, we from a sort of storytelling perspective just wanted to tell the story as accurately as we could, really.
Yeah, and it's amazing how a soundtrack can add impact to even the most boring piece of film. Not that I'm saying your film is boring, Gunnar, but the soundtrack can absolutely make it work. When Karin is listening to the radio in that kitchen, are they listening to East German stations, or are they listening to, for example, radio in the American sector, RIAS, which was broadcasting, Western pop music?
I should actually stress that because it's a short film, it's only 25 minutes, we are telling quite a compact story in quite a short amount of time. So for us, trying to portray the sense of this is a police state, without doing it hopefully in a cliche sort of, here's a Western film crew trying to tell a Hollywoodized sense of what the sort of living in an Eastern Bloc state was like. But just trying to give the audience a sense that actually this is ultimately a dictatorship. And Erich Honecker is the chairman or the general secretary of the Socialist Unity Party. So for us, it was trying to build that sense. And actually, so effectively, long story short, the radio segments are a means of telling the audience that indirectly. So a lot of it is Karin listening to state broadcasts by Erich Honecker, who is voiced by Paul Freeman, but also the sort of regular state broadcast and sort of dating of sort of state information, if you like, by the regular radio host on DDR Radio 1 in East Germany, a guy called Herbert Kofer, which is voiced in our film by Christopher Eccleston. So he basically, or that sort of sense of it, sort of brings in this idea that actually they live in a police state. And, as I say, in a short amount of time, they're just trying to put that across to the audience in a succinct way. But it also served as a way of sort of just being a barometer for the audience to understand where we are at a particular point in time. I know towards the end of the film, those who are familiar with the true story will know that Chris and Christine fled on the basis that twofold. One was that the standing order to shoot had been removed, but also second to that, and perhaps even more pertinent to that, was this idea that sort of had been lifted due to the state visit of Swedish Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson. So that on the radio and Karin listening to that is another important barometer of where we are in history. So it almost there's a sort of sense of building the world building again, but also historical understanding of where we are in the timeline. That's really where the extent of it.
So sort of useful shortcuts in terms of giving the viewer an idea of the timeline without you making it obvious. Wendy, and I want to ask Cameron this one as well, what scenes were the most challenging for you, would you say?
Well, for me, it was the moment that Karin is in bed after she says goodbye to her son, who she doesn't know is going to be attempting to breach the wall. And she's just reading a book, and it's a beautiful scene. It's set up. It's so simple. She's in bed. She's got her reading glasses on, and she's reading a book, and she hears gunshots. And all it is she sits up and she looks out the window. And I remember in the documentary film, in Klaus's film, I think she was asked about that, and she had a feeling. She said she had a feeling. She just had this feeling. And having experienced again that as a mom living in New York City, you can hear all the sirens down here. It was hard because I wanted to get across the idea that she had this feeling, this premonition of sorts. And I finally thought, I don't need to do that. I just need to play the scene. Here's what happens. I'm reading a book. I hear some gunshots. I turn around. I look out the window. I don't need to forecast anything. But it took me a while. And you don't know this, Brandon, but it took me a while on set to just go, just chill. Just chill out, right? What do you look like, Wendy, when you have a premonition? Like nothing. It's something that happens somewhere in here. So I did a little bit of prep on it, and that was the hardest scene for me, both emotionally as a mom and also just as an actor, to try to get out of the wrong-headedness that I was going about doing the scene with.
That's really good insight into how an actor thinks, I guess. Cameron, what would you say was the most challenging scene? Probably every scene, because your big brother was telling you what to do. No,
I'd say I think the first scene was difficult because you knew the weight of what you were about to enter and what you were about to begin doing. We were playing real people, but I was very conscious from the start. We had very limited, resources available to know what these characters were like as real people. That actually gave us a bit of creative freedom to kind of design these characters in our own way. And sometimes, and I think you hear this more commonly with biopics. With this, we had less kind of material to work with to know exactly how he sounded or to know exactly how he moved or walked, whatever. We knew he was a gymnast, so we knew he was mobile. And we knew he was an inspiring actor. So there's different things we could we could put on. I had some photographs of him in certain poses that kind of suggested how he might move or how he might act and stuff like that. But it was very limited stuff to work with. So that gave us the creative freedom to do what we wanted to do, but you needed to make some decisions. And, whatever decisions were made on that first scene, on that first day, I would need to kind of stick with. And that's talking about, using some variation of a German accent. But it's also about, people act differently around different people. And I think you see that with this character. He's got his best mate and he's got his mum and his brother. And those are two very different relationships. So I wanted to make sure that came across. So I was very conscious of that. I think there was a scene, I think it was the last scene me and Wendy filmed together was the scene where my character leaves the flat for the last time. And if maybe the scene that Wendy was describing was almost, it's the moment that she realizes that perhaps her son has been shot. She hears the shot and she has the sixth sense feeling. That's kind of almost her mourning the son. There was this moment where my character leaves the mum and leaves the flat for the last time. And it was almost like he's mourning his mum in this particular moment. So for me, that was an important moment. And with that, it was a more difficult scene to do.
When is this film going to be available to watch, and where would we be able to watch it, Brandon?
Yes, so we, as we speak, right, the film is completed and wrapped and in the can. So we are currently on a process of submitting it out to sort of the world of sort of international film festivals and trying to get it on the circuit. So sort of slightly later this year, it will be on the international film festival circuit. Hopefully, audiences or listeners around the world might have an opportunity to watch it in their local city or town film festival. But from there, it will have sort of two inaugural screenings, one here in Guernsey, where it was sort of shot and financed. I should also say that it was financed and supported in large part by an organisation called Guernsey Arts. And then we'll also have an inaugural screening in Berlin, the DDR Museum, who also sort of supported it financially and otherwise as well. And then from there, it will live its life at the DDR Museum. So they've effectively got the right to sort of screen it whenever they like, and it will be available in the cinema down there in the museum in Berlin, hopefully for forevermore, or for at least, the foreseeable future. So if any listeners are in Berlin from, I'd probably want to say September, October time this year through to hopefully, forevermore, then if they pop down to the DDR Museum, hopefully it will be on the show for them to watch.
Great. So Campbell and Wendy, you get repeat fees for every showing, do you?
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge residual tax.
And how soon will we expect to see a trailer for it?
I think within the next month. It's just really trying to just tell this true tragic story the best we can, and do it justice for Chris, his family, and loved ones. But really, the film is dedicated to. There's a nice line at the end of the film before it closes out, just saying that the film is dedicated to all victims of the Berlin Wall, and it really is. That's kind of where we're ultimately dedicating the project to. So just trying to make sure that these stories live on, and that these tragic tales aren't lost to time.
There's been various updates since we recorded. The trailer has been released, and this is available on the Golden Goat Films Facebook and Instagram pages. That's at Golden Goat Films. The world premiere of the film is at the Sunderland Shorts Film Festival at 6 o'clock on Friday the 16th of May at the Omniplex Sunderland. Cast and crew will be in attendance, so if you're in the area, please do join them. The Canadian premiere is in September at the Toronto International Nollywood Film Festival, which makes the film Canadian Screen Award qualifying, which opens up its route to the Academy Awards if they're lucky enough. The Guernsey premiere is on September the 12th and the Berlin premiere is on October the 2nd at the DDR Museum. There'll be links to all of these in the episode information. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.